Greetings, photo fans, and thank you for tuning in to my free webinar about photographing water. This is the first of a series of webinars that I'm co-producing with Paul Nguyen of OldeStirlingVillage Media. So we're hoping to bring you a lot of great content about photography. Paul Nguyen has set up sort of a webinar academy with which he has experts in several fields present on various topics, and I'm honored to be the expert on photography. So this is the talk I'm giving to you today, which is based on a live talk that I give to camera clubs around the Boston area, and hopefully it will help you to get a better understanding of how to use your camera to make artistic captures of water. So I'm Paul Nguyen, photographer and instructor with Blue Hour Photo Ventures, and some of the concepts I'll be presenting on today will be best practiced live, in which case I also give live lessons and workshops and also photo tours with Blue Hour Photo Ventures. So the purpose of photographing water, or photographing anything really, is to capture the essence of what it is. Water, it either moves or it stays still, and our goal as photographers is to capture that and to convey the essence of what it's doing, to either make it look like it's moving or to make it look like it's staying still. There are two main looks for photographs of moving water. One of the looks is where the water is frozen in time. This is typically captured with a very high shutter speed. Or the more impressionistic, artistic look, where water is appearing flowy or wispy or more impressionistic in nature. Typically, what people see in fine art photography is this second look here, where the water looks like it's, wisping out, ribbony, cotton candy-like. And so that's what I'm going to focus on first, how to capture the water in more of a flowing, wispy way. This is accomplished with a long exposure. So in order to make this kind of capture, you need to have a camera that is capable of being controlled by you. In other words, a DSLR camera, which is a digital camera based on the old-time film cameras that we used way back decades ago, it seems now at this point. Or one of the new mirrorless cameras, which is like a DSLR but without an optical viewfinder. The reason why you need one of these types of cameras is it lets you be in control. It lets you be the boss. And the reason why you need to be the boss is that you need to control certain parameters so that you can get the exposure time that you want in order to get water to look this way. So the basic gear and settings that you'll need to make a shot of flowing water with the long exposure are, other than your DSLR camera or mirrorless camera, are a tripod, because this helps you to keep your camera steady while it's in the landscape. A remote release, because a remote release lets you trigger your camera without actually pressing the button on the camera, because every time you press the button on the camera, it actually shakes the camera a little bit, and that's going to cause a blur even when you're on a tripod. The next thing you need to do is set your camera to its lowest ISO setting. So ISO is analogous to the film speeds of the days of yore, when we were able to go to the drugstore and buy Kodak ISO 100 film, or 400, or ISO 1000. And the lower the number, the less sensitive the film would be, but the higher quality the picture would be. ISO for your digital camera is the same way. If you set it to the lowest setting, which is typically ISO 100 for most cameras, then you're going to get the highest picture quality, but it's also the least sensitivity. The reason why you want a low sensitivity is anytime your sensor has a low sensitivity, you need to gather light for longer, because basically you're capturing less light at a time. You need to gather light for longer, and gathering light for longer essentially translates to a longer shutter speed. The next parameter is to set a small aperture, or a high f-stop number. On your camera, when you set your f-stops, which go from 2.8, 4, or 5.6, all the way up to f11, f16, f22, etc., the higher the number that you set, the smaller the aperture is going to be. And you'll usually, for water photography, use a higher number, like f16 or f22, something like that. A small aperture lets in less light. And again, just like the low ISO setting, when you let in less light, you tend to have to gather light for longer to get the same kind of exposure. Anytime you're gathering light for longer, that translates to a slower shutter speed, longer exposure. And then the next thing you're looking for is conditions, the ambient lighting conditions. So you'll go for conditions that are overcast or shade or dim, dim meaning after the sun has gone down below the horizon. And again, the reason why you're looking for these conditions is that these are lower light conditions. And low light, once again, leads to having to capture light for longer, which results in a long shutter speed, right? So all these things work together to give you the maximum kind of flexibility of long exposure that you're looking for. And your goal in the end is going to be a shutter speed that's somewhere between half a second and 5 seconds. I find that water that's moving, whether it be in a stream or in the ocean, typically looks good with a shutter speed that's between half a second and 5 seconds. Well, there are different shutter speeds you can use, and sometimes it's hard to see if you're looking at this on a small screen. But I took 3 example shots of the exact same scene using 3 different shutter speeds between 0.8 seconds and 4 seconds. So this one over on the left here, which I'm vigorously circling with my mouse pointer, is the shortest shutter speed, and this one is the longest shutter speed. So I'm not sure how much detail you guys can see, but if you look at the one on the left, it actually shows the most texture in the water. So the shorter the shutter speed you use, the more texture you're going to see in the water. And then as you extend your shutter speed over to what we have on the right here, 4 seconds or longer, the water just becomes progressively more wispy, meaning it's not going to show any kind of choppiness or texture at all. It's just going to turn into eventually just froth or foam or cloud, right? So if I were to extend this beyond 4 seconds even and go to 20 seconds or something, all you'd see is kind of like a white sort of haze on the water. So there's definitely a balance that you want to strike here. You don't want a shutter speed that's too short because then it basically doesn't look like the water is moving at all. And then you don't want a shutter speed that's too long either because then you can't really even tell that it's moving at that point either, right? Because it just looks like it's a sheet of white haze.
Okay, Paul, can I stop you for 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to unmute everybody here, and if somebody's got a comment, I'm just concerned about the technical quality. If you've got a comment, since we're doing this for the first time and we don't want to leave anybody out.
Yes, absolutely. And I should mention that if anybody has a question or comment, please ask it during the presentation. That's fine with me. I love to answer questions as they come up because it actually helps me to become a better presenter when I know that people are interacting with me.
You can do that by raising.
I see that there's a little comment here, and I'm going to read what it is. Okay, so is there a message there, Paul?
I don't think there's any. Everybody's unmuted, I think. So if anybody has a comment about they're not getting this or you're having a problem, you can speak up now.
Okay, yeah, and likewise, if you have a question about what I'm presenting on up till this point or at any point, feel free to raise a hand and ask.
Right. Rita, you do have your hand raised. Is there a reason for that? What would you like to know?
That's a mistake on my end. I'm going to lower my hand.
Oh, okay. Listen, there are a lot of mistakes.
I'm following everything so far. Thank you.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad you are.
Yeah, no problem, Rita. Anytime you have a question, feel free to ask. So, but thank you for clarifying that.
And
sorry about that.
We appreciate everybody's patience, okay? Okay, Paul, you should be able to go ahead. I'm going to mute all the attendees and myself now. Go ahead, Paul. Oop. Hello, Paul?
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah,
you just unmuted me. That's very good. Thank you.
You're all set. Go ahead.
Okay. Sure. So the whole goal in everything I've said thus far is basically to slow down your shutter speed, right? To make sure you have as slow an exposure as possible. And the ways that we talked about were to let less light into your camera and to make your camera less light sensitive. So the ISO setting would lower the sensitivity of your camera, which thus lengthens your shutter speed, and also closing down the aperture, so to a high number or a small opening, which is one and the same in photography. Go for f16 or f22. That lets less light through your lens. That will slow down the shutter speed as well. And then you use conditions that slow down your shutter speed. You use dawn or dusk or cloudy day or very dim conditions, And that also reduces the amount of light that's available. And basically anything that reduces the amount of light coming into your camera forces you or allows you to use a long shutter speed. But every now and then, everything that you do and everything that's presented to you just is not enough, right? And so what do you do when you still need a longer shutter speed? You tried everything, you're at ISO 100 or even ISO 50, you're at f22, and there's just still too much light. Well, photographers use these things called neutral density filters, which are basically just sunglasses for your camera. Just imagine putting like a very dark piece of glass in front of your lens, and that just reduces further the amount of light that comes into your camera. So as you see on the right sidebar here, you use this when the ambient light is still too bright, or you just need a much longer shutter speed. You have a little bit of flexibility here because sometimes you need to compensate for the fact that there's too much light, and sometimes as a creative person, you just want to have a longer shutter speed. So these filters, which are like sunglasses, they limit the amount of light reaching your camera's sensor. And they're stackable, meaning you can put sunglasses on top of sunglasses and they just keep getting darker and darker. Well, you can do the same things with these neutral density filters. And you can buy these to fit your lens. And you can either buy them as single neutral density filters, which will reduce the amount of light coming into your lens, and then you can stack them, or you can buy a variable neutral density filter, which lets you adjust the amount of light that is being sent to your camera's lens. So you can have it be somewhat clear, or you can turn this filter, and then it gets very, very dark. And I wish, you could see this in person, because then I could actually demonstrate that filter to you in a live context. But once you have these filters on, you can meter through your camera the same way you would without the filter. In other words, you put the filter on, and then you use your camera in the aperture priority mode or the manual mode, just as you would. And your camera will, under most circumstances, be able to calculate a new exposure time for you. Okay? So what you see in this picture here is I stacked, I didn't stack, I used a variable neutral density filter with 8 stops of light reduction, and I photographed very early in the day, and I used a small aperture, or high number for my f-stop, and I used a low ISO, right? And with that combination of factors, I was able to milk a 25-second exposure out of this scene. So light coming into your camera is kind of like water going into a bucket. Think of it this way. You can either fill the bucket with a ton of water at once, in which case the bucket will fill very quickly, or you can put 1 drop of water in the bucket at a time, and over a very, very, very long time, that bucket will still get full, right? So light and your camera are kind of like water into a bucket. If you reduce the amount of light coming into your camera and you expose it for a very, very, very long time, eventually you'll get an exposure that kind of looks the same brightness as if you'd taken the same shot with a lot of light over a short period of time, right? So just always remember that analogy that a camera is like a bucket and light is like water, right? So that's how I was able to get a 25-second long exposure. It kind of looks like, except for the swirling water, it's the same brightness as a normal exposure I might take with my camera on a normal day, under normal conditions, right? With the one change being that with this absurdly long shutter speed, all this water is moving for a long time, and so you get this very nice abstract spiral pattern that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. And like I said, let me know if you have any questions about this as I'm speaking. So one thing you can do with long exposures also, other than creating wispy, impressionistic flowing effects, is that you can actually flatten choppy water. This photo that I'm showing you here, I took in Salem, Mass, at the Fort Pickering Lighthouse near Winter Island Yacht Club, and it was actually a very choppy morning. It was windy and the water was kind of whitecapping and bouncing all around, but by using a long exposure with my neutral density filter and very little light, I was able to simplify the composition by removing all the things that were choppy and moving. So I created more of a mirror-like surface, kind of a dull mirror, but a mirror nonetheless. And the point of this was to make the scene look calmer than it was in real life. So I actually titled this photo Morning Calm, because when you look at it, it looks very calm, but even in real life, it was not calm at all. It was actually very choppy. So that's some of the stuff that you can do by using a long exposure. You can create something that wasn't there to begin with, and you can do it all in camera. So this is the stuff that's been going on for, decades and decades. So We did it with film, and now we can still do it with digital. And I prefer to do things in the analog style whenever possible, rather than trying to do it in the computer. I was trained in film, so I could do it with film, so I may as well do it the same way with digital. So other than making choppy water seem calm, we can make calm water look even calmer. So at this picture at Lake Tahoe at sunset, I used, again, a very long exposure and a slight amount of neutral density to iron out even the slightest bit of movement in the water, and that created an absolute mirror-like surface on this lake's surface at dusk. So to recap those two things, you can make choppy water look calm and calm water look even calmer by using a long exposure. And remember, for all of these concepts, I'm using a tripod, I'm using sometimes a neutral density filter, I'm always using a remote release, and I'm using generally very low ISO setting, and I'm using a high aperture, a high f-stop number, which produces a small aperture. So nature has its own neutral density filter as well, which is to shoot in darkness. Essentially, anytime you go beyond 20 minutes after sunset or 20 minutes before sunrise, you're looking at very, very dim conditions. The human eye usually at this time is really adapting to try to see anything, but the camera still perceives things just fine if you give it a long enough shutter speed. So I always have, I live by this quote that the best light is almost no light at all, and most of my photography that you see at the shows and most of my shots that are popular and that are kind of the heart of my portfolio are taken in very low light conditions. Because when the sun goes down, exposure times lengthen dramatically, so you may not even need to use a neutral density filter at all, because nature is providing that dimness for you. The photo that you see on the left was taken in the blue hour. That color that you see that's blue is natural, because about 20 minutes after the sun goes down on a clear day, everything just sort of turns blue, hence the blue hour. And I was able to get a 25-second exposure during that time, and it just kind of made the water surface there, again, like a mirror, because I'm just ironing out all the imperfections in the water. And the one on the right I took at Duxbury Beach at midnight using a 4-minute exposure, and the only source of illumination here is just very distant light. So you'll see that as everything gets darker, your exposure time just gets longer and longer and longer, and you're just able to create these very, very abstract compositions. So a small note on color. When the light gets very dim, the human eye cannot see color anymore because we have two kinds of optical cells in our retina, rods and cones. You might have heard of them from biology class. Cones are the cells that help us to see color, and rods are the cells that help us to see shapes. When we see shapes, we see them in black and white, and then cones kind of add the element of color. Well, in very little light, the human eye's cones don't work anymore, and only the rods work. So that's why when we look at things in the dark, we tend to see just shapes, and we see very little color. But the camera doesn't quite work that way. It actually sees color equally well in very dim light, which is why when I shoot in almost no light at all, like I do in the picture on the left, it comes out blue to the camera. And to the human eye, when I'm standing there taking the shot, it doesn't look like much of anything. It just looks like a series of silhouettes of these pilings. So people will often ask, are these colors real? Is that what it really looked like? And I'll say, well, I mean, it didn't really look like anything at the time, but the colors are real because those are the colors that the camera sees, right? So at this level of photography, reality kind of becomes a little bit of a non-factor because you're not shooting according to what you see anymore because the human eye can't really see anything, right? So it's kind of nice to be freed of the idea of making things look like what you saw because, you know, it kind of removes you of the expectation of reproduction, and it just allows you to be an artist. So you can just say, okay, well, this is what the camera perceived, and this is natural. This is there. This was real life. So this was another thing that I did with super long exposure. It's a 60-second exposure just using full moonlight. So again, I'm abstracting reality. I'm letting water flow. I'm letting mist come out of this geyser. I'm letting clouds move across the sky using very little light, and it creates something more than what you would see with the eye during the daytime. people will look at this and they won't believe that I took it by moonlight because it looks like a well-exposed photograph, right? But moonlight is the same sort of directionality as sunlight. In other words, if you take a picture with sunlight diffused through clouds, or you take a picture with moonlight diffused through clouds, the two will look about the same if you get your exposure times right. And so going back to the bucket analogy, if I use moonlight, which is much dimmer than sunlight, I just need to use a longer exposure. But the overall picture will look just as bright as if I'd taken it with sunlight diffused through clouds. The only difference being with a longer exposure, there's more motion that is allowed to happen, and so you get a much more abstract look in your photograph, which of course I prefer, because if you've ever seen my work in person, almost everything is done with, almost all of my landscapes involving water and clouds are done with long exposures. So now I'm going to talk.
Paul?
You have a question?
Yeah, no, I don't have a question, but I just thought it might be a good chance to, if anybody did right now, take a break here. I will unmute everybody, and in case somebody's having trouble asking a question, and you are all unmuted if anybody has a comment. Okay. I assume people.
Hey, well, this is Can I get started to my question?
Sure, yeah, fire away.
There was some sort of a rock or something in the center of this picture there, the one that you just changed, the slide just before this one, yeah.
One, yes.
Yeah, is that the way it is, or it just looks distorted because of the long exposure?
This is the way it is, yep. So all the scenery that you see is exactly as it was. The only thing that the long exposure does is it causes the water to look like it's moving and the clouds to look like it's moving.
Okay.
So which distortion are you talking about? The lump, the three?
Yeah, right, the one in the center, the reddish, whatever, it's like a big piece of rock on top of the...
That is actually a natural formation. So this geyser was formed when people were drilling for oil back in the 1950s, and they hit a mineral spring by mistake, and it created this geyser. And because all the minerals are different densities, it's separated into a bunch of different layers that grew over the years. So the geyser is actually 9 feet tall at the top. And this is all a natural formation. So if you showed up in person, you'd actually see it like this. The interesting thing about it is when I photographed it, I actually didn't see it at all because I took this in the dark. So I actually only see a silhouette. And only when I actually took the picture and exposed it fully did I actually know what it looked like. So yes, it really did look like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I should tell the audience, by the way, that we have been recording since about 2 minutes into the presentation. I know that I just want to let people know that you are being recorded for, I don't think anybody's to worry about it, but I do want to let you know.
I don't think anybody's embarrassing themselves right now.
So no, I know that, but I just for disclosure purposes, I want to know that. All right, yeah. I'm going to mute everybody else, and you can go on, Paul. Go ahead.
Cool.
Oh. There you go, Paul. When I mute everybody, you get muted, too. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So here's something I'm going to talk about that photo instructors almost never talk about is when you're taking a vertical picture of something, there are certain concerns that you want to have. So there are two ways to take verticals. One is with your camera's native ratio, which is, for most DSLR cameras, it's a 3:2 ratio, meaning the rectangle is kind of like a 3:2 size proportion. And then there's the old school kind of 5:4 ratio, which was present back in the days of medium format and large format cameras. When you flip your camera on edge to take a vertical photo of a waterfall that seems to be just so tall, or the scenery is so tall that it doesn't seem to fit well in the conventional landscape format, then you tend to get a picture that looks very tall and skinny. Like the one on the left is the native 3:2 ratio when I turn it on its side. And most people are kind of surprised at how much taller it looks than you would think when you turn it on its side. It's almost like it's too tall and narrow for most compositions. But for the one that I did, it happens to work because the composition is long. And so it works for that one. But in other compositions, you'd actually want to crop your photo to the native 5:4 ratio. And 5:4 also happens to be the same ratio as 8:10. So we've all heard of an 8:10 print, right? And you're saying, well, you might be wondering why so many prints are made in 8:10 when our cameras really would be producing an 8:12 print in the 3:2 ratio. It's because classically, before 35mm cameras were invented, the classical ratio was 5:4 or 8:10, right? 10:8, I guess, if you were to say 5:4. So these days, when you're shooting vertically, I actually find it more aesthetically pleasing to crop your photo to the 5:4 or the 8:10 ratio because it gives it a little bit more balance. So I'll give you now a little rundown of the benefits of either ratio. The vertical 3:2, which is the native ratio of your camera, meaning you don't crop at all, it's a long and narrow look. It looks even longer and taller when you turn it on its side than when you turn it on its edge, rather than when you keep it kind of in its natural horizontal orientation. And you use it to emphasize the height or the verticality of your subject. It's not the good look for most subjects, but it works for certain things that are naturally what you want to emphasize the height or the narrow or the verticality of it. And the idea is don't be restricted to this ratio just because it's the native format of your camera. You can crop, right? There's nothing wrong with that. The vertical 5:4, which we're talking about on the right side now, is a more balanced appearance. It's what we use in portraiture. So if you ever see a portrait of somebody, chances are it's 8:10 or it's 4:5, and it looks a lot better because you're emphasizing kind of a more balanced look rather than the length or the height of a person. The difference between this crop and shooting vertically in the native 3:2 is this requires some kind of forethought. You have to compose in your camera with the intention of chopping off either the top or the bottom or a little bit of both. So what I usually do when I shoot a vertical is I'll take one in the native resolution, the native ratio of 3:2, and then I'll step back a bit or I'll zoom out a bit, and then I'll take the same shot. When I zoom out a bit and I take the same shot, it tells me that later on I can use either the 3:2 ratio, or I can crop the one that I zoomed out on and have a 5:4 picture that looks essentially the same. It's the same scene, but it just has more of a balanced look, right? So to quickly recap, you can either turn it on its edge, take the picture, and keep the 3:2, or you can take that picture and then zoom out and take another picture with the intention of cropping later, so that you'll have the vertical 5:4 look, which you can make an 8:10 print out of, and have it look more like a portrait. Ideally, you'll do both, right? Because when you're doing a landscape shoot, you're on a tripod, everything's already composed for you, so you may as well do both. So I'm going to talk about more artistic considerations now. Water is interesting in and of itself, and your subject is interesting in and of itself, but the most interesting compositions I find are when there's some kind of interaction between elements in your photograph, right? So this driftwood branch in the west coast of New Zealand, if it was just water by itself, it would be kind of boring. And if this driftwood were just sitting on the beach by itself, it would be kind of boring, right? So I waited for the tide to be right, and this is part of kind of the discipline of nature photography, is sometimes things aren't right, but you come back, right? You wait, you come back. Here I waited for the tide to interact with the log, so you get a swirling pattern kind of going around the driftwood branch, and that creates a much more impressive and kind of inspiring kind of composition. So just remember, interaction tells a story, and telling a story is often the point of a photograph, right? At least an artistic one. So in this one, again, we have interaction. We have the more rocky boulders in New Zealand, which would sit on the beach by themselves if the tide was low, or they'd be completely immersed in water if the tide was high. But in this case, I chose a foreground subject, and I decided to wait until the moment that the water interacted with it. So the water is kind of washing inside this broken boulder here, and it's swirling around inside the geode part of the boulder, and it's a much more interesting composition because the water is not standing alone and the rocks aren't standing alone. The two are interacting with each other. And likewise here, shipwreck sitting stranded on the beach would look okay, and water without this subject of the shipwreck here would look cool because the sunset's very nice, but when you put the two together, that's when you have a photograph, right? So interaction and allow water to tell its part of the story. So this goes back to the difference between what makes you a great photographer and an okay photographer, right? An okay photographer will settle for a picture of a sunset with nothing else, right? A great photographer looks for a subject and then places the sunset behind it. An okay photographer will take a picture of flowing water kind of by itself. A great photographer will have flowing water interacting with something and telling a story. So this is your way of going one step beyond the typical photograph and doing something that's really a piece of art that you can hang on your wall and be proud of for a long, long time, and people will look at it more than once. They'll probably look at it a bunch of times and even ask you how you did it, right? Here, again, I'm telling the story of water and the intertidal zone. These starfish are kind of clinging on for dear life, and the turbulent water would be kind of flowing around them all day. In high tide, low tide, there's water surging around these intertidal critters, and this is telling the story of their resilience, right? The surging water moving about dramatically, and then the sea stars, the starfish, just rock solid, hanging on for dear life all day. So doing photography of water requires a bit more research than people think. The shot of Thor's Well, which is this feature off the coast of Oregon that I've photographed here, this phenomenon where the water is falling through this hole and it looks like the entire ocean is just draining through this sinkhole, this only happens an hour before to an hour after high tide. So if I want to take this picture at sunset, that requires another level of planning because I have to take this picture at high tide, and the high tide has to coincide with sunset, which actually doesn't happen every day, right? Because the cyclical tides actually shift a little bit. They're offset by something like half an hour to 45 minutes every day in this location. So in order to take this picture at sunset, you can only arrive at one particular time of the month, and you have a window of about 2 days where you can actually take this picture and get this sort of sunset and the hole in the ocean look. So you do your research if you really want that shot. And to do that, you look at tide tables. Tide tables can be downloaded onto your computer, or you can have them on your smartphone or tablet. And they make them for fisher people and for boaters, and so photographers use them also. Research lunar cycles, because lunar cycles will usually tell you when the tides are the highest, right? You get high tides at highest tides at full moons and new moons. You look for seasonal ebbs and flows in streams and waterfalls. So peak flow in streams and waterfalls can often come in the spring after the heavy rain. So, for instance, if you're photographing in the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon, you would have to know that all the rain tends to happen in the spring, and in the summer, things just get drier and drier and drier until the fall when things are basically dry. If you're photographing on the East Coast, it's different, right? Because we get rain in the spring, we get snow melt in the spring, and then the summers get a little bit drier, but then we get more rain in the fall, right? So you kind of get 2 periods of big flow. And, of course, look for the times when the water phenomena like Thor's Well will happen. Thor's Well is an ocean geyser, so it happens at very specific periods. And if you've ever heard of Thunder Hole in Acadia, which makes the big boom and the big splash, that also happens only on a specific period, right? So these are the things that you look into if you really want to get the great pictures of water. So there are certain times, of course, when you don't want to do the wispy water thing and you just want your pictures to maintain the ripples that they have. And one of those times is when you kind of get these cool textures that are actually created by the ripples themselves, right? So here, if I were to use a long exposure and it actually erased all of the ripple texture in this water, then you wouldn't get these cool kind of wavy lines, because the wavy lines kind of create an abstraction that are contrasted with the very straight blades of grass that appear in real life, right? So here, I actually wanted to use a short exposure, because a short exposure will maintain these ripples and give you these wavy lines that you're looking for. Another time that you really want a short exposure is when you want to freeze water in motion. This is a wildlife photograph. So sometimes in wildlife photography, you want to emphasize certain things. You want to emphasize, in this case, how the water splashes up onto the body of the horseshoe crab. And here, with all the froth and all the foam, you can kind of emphasize the true turbulence of the water rather than making it calmer with a longer exposure, right? So here you get the turbulence and the froth and the violence of the water. And my purpose in doing this was to illustrate kind of what horseshoe crabs have to go through in the course of their life cycle. They only come up onto the beach to lay eggs, right? And they do this on a high tide by full moon in the spring, and that's the only time that I'm there photographing them because I'll know they'll be on the beach. But in order to make it up on the beach, they're enduring an incredible amount of hardship through all this wave action. And with a short exposure, I can capture all their trials and tribulations. When the wave hits the horseshoe crab the correct way, which is on the left, it kind of bounces off because they're built like tanks. But if the horseshoe crab should happen to flip over, it's a very, very tough journey for the critter after that, because once you flipped on your side, you're just being on your back, you're just being tossed around in the ocean like a buoy, and there's very little that you can do about it, right? So left is correct way for the horseshoe crab, right is the incorrect way if you're a horseshoe crab. And this is why horseshoe crabs come up by tens of thousands and lay millions and millions of eggs, because, let's face it, many of them just don't make it, right, because of the scenario on the right. So for fast-moving water, you'll use very fast shutter speeds, 1/1000th of a second or faster. So when you want a fast shutter speed, you have to do kind of the opposite of what you were doing with the long exposure. Capture fine detail in moving water using a fast shutter speed requires brighter level of ambient light. So you'll see that for these fast shots, I'm using pretty much full sun here. It doesn't have to be full midday sun, but it does require a lot of light. If you don't have a lot of light, you'll need to use a higher ISO, right? So you'll be cranking your ISO number up to 400 or 800 or 1,000 or 1,600, right? These are mimicking film speeds, again, like I said. So it's like using a faster film. So anytime you use more light or faster film or higher ISO sensitivity, it lets you use a shorter shutter speed. And likewise, another thing that you would do is you would use a larger aperture. So you're using f2.8 or f4 or f5.6. And that lets you use, again, that lets more light into your camera and lets you use a faster shutter speed. So to recap, 3 things that are the opposite of what we use for the long exposure are brighter ambient light, higher ISO, and a larger aperture.
Okay, Paul, why don't we break for some questions here? This seems like a natural spot.
Okay, very good.
If you got a question, raise your hand there. I won't unmute everybody this time. I don't see any questions. If not, send me a chat. I've been chatting here with John a little bit. So anyways, okay, I guess nobody has any questions. If you do, just raise your hand there, and we will answer them, or you can send it in your chat message there.
That just means I'm either super clear or I'm super confusing. So
that's right. Well, I'm learning a lot. I know that. That's one thing.
Okay, cool.
Okay, good. All right, go ahead, Paul.
All right. So going back to the idea of mirror-like surfaces, another thing that you'll want to, another trick that you'll want to emphasize when you're photographing water and you want to show a lot of reflection is to use a low angle of perspective or have your light source be at a low angle. So your light source in this case is the sun. And when you photograph at sunrise or sunset, you have a very low angle of incident light, right? And the way you create a low angle of perspective for yourself is to get very low to the ground. So when you place yourself low to the ground and you put your tripod very low to the ground, you're going to get more reflection. Most people don't realize this, so try this next time, that when you're taking a picture of a reflection, when you get down low, it emphasizes the surface reflection so that the reflected image looks closer in brightness to the source image. In this case, since I'm getting very low, the mountain in the reflection looks very much closer to the brightness of the mountain in the real world, the mountain above water. Whereas if I were to stand really high, I'd actually see more of the lake bottom. So the higher you stand, the more you see of the underneath the reflection, and then the lower you get, the more reflection you see. So try that next time you're out on a very calm lake, or even after it rains, a puddle in your own driveway, right? If you get really low, you'll see more of the reflection of the house around you, and if you stand up, you'll see kind of the bottom of the puddle. You'll see more of the asphalt underneath the water's surface. Here's another instance where I'm taking a picture of water and I'm using a high angle of perspective or light source. So in this case, the light source is the full moon that has risen over Half Dome in Yosemite, California. And because the angle of light is so high, it's actually illuminating the bottom of the lake, right? So this is Mirror Lake, and normally you'd expect to see a mirror-like reflection of Half Dome in its surface, but that would be if the incident light was very low. Since I'm photographing in the dark, the only light source is the moon here, so it's illuminating through the lake's surface and I can see the bottom. So these are some of the techniques that you can use when you're out on your next shoot. If you want to see more reflection, get down low or shoot at sunrise or sunset. Or when you want to see the bottom of the surface, shoot with a full moon high up in the sky or high sun up in the sky. Water, when you photograph it up close, can actually become a lens. So when you get very close and you use a lens that can get very close, water, because of the nature of its surface tension properties, actually curls up into a little ball. And the ball acts as a lens. It refracts all the light coming from behind it. And one thing that a lens does is it tends to flip things upside down, right? So in this picture that you're seeing here, there are hundreds of sunsets that you can see in these drops because the sunrises, I should say, because the sun is rising behind the water droplets, and it's being refracted by this lens that is made of water. When I took the picture, it was actually upside down, meaning the droplets actually show the sun setting in a reverse direction. And I actually flipped the entire image right side up so that the viewer can relate to what's going on in the image. So now you can actually see there's a landscape in every drop, and there's a sunrise in every single drop. So when you have hundreds of drops, it's kind of like you're having hundreds of copies of the source image. And in order to take pictures of water like this, you need to get very close, like I said, and you need to use a macro lens under most circumstances. Here's another case when you can use droplets to make your own lenses. You can use a misting bottle, like a spray bottle that you would use for your plants, right? And you can just create your own water droplets. In this one here, this was actually natural morning dew that condensed on a spider web. But in this one here, I actually sprayed water onto the praying mantis's face. And praying mantises are actually very calm, so they don't mind this at all. And you can get very close and take a picture of the mantises. And you'll notice one thing is that every picture, every droplet, I should say, has a little circle in it. And that's because I'm using a flash that's in the shape of the circle in the front of my lens. And because I'm using this frontal light source with all these different lenses, in this case, the water is reflecting that flash back towards me. So that's how I'm getting all these little C-shaped or C-shapes or circles in every drop, because the water is, in this case, mirroring it back to me. So instead of tiny little lenses, you actually get tiny little mirrors in this case. So one thing I always talk about is what you can do when you get to the next level in your photography. And you may not want to try this right away, but maybe someday when you get bored of just doing normal exposures of water and then get bored of doing long exposures of water, you can start to go for extremely, extremely long exposures of water, right? So what I'm using here is I'm using a gel, which is essentially an even darker version of sunglasses for my camera that I can't even see through with the naked eye at all. And I put that in front of my lens. And with that, I'm able to reduce the amount of light going into my camera by 13.5 stops, with every stop being like a doubling or a halving of light, right? So when I talk about one f-stop of light, that's actually, and I'm cutting the amount of light by one stop, that's actually halving the amount of light that's reaching my camera. When I use 13.5 stops of replication, that's essentially halving the amount of light that's reaching my camera almost 14 times, right? Which is a lot of light reduction. So you're going to get a very, very long exposure time. So for this picture of the Boneyard Beach in South Carolina, I'm actually using a 3-minute exposure in broad daylight, which is impossible to do without a very, very, very dark filter. And the way you would take this shot is that since you can't see through your camera with this much filtration on there, with this much darkness kind of to look through, what you'd actually have to do is compose your shot without the filter, meter your shot without the filter, then put the filter on and calculate the number of stops of light reduction that you've employed here, and then multiply your exposure time through to get your final shutter speed, right? So this is something you may not try for some time, but it's putting it out there to let you know what kind of the outer limits of long exposure photography really are, right? There's really no limit to the exposure times you can use, and it's just a matter of how ambitious and how creative you want to be. You can start to make exposures that are looking very Salvador Dali-like at this point, right? Like this one, because it just smooths out everything. It creates a lot of density and color, and it creates impressions of motions that you wouldn't be able to ever create with realistic shutter speeds. So the whole point of this webinar is to give you an intro to what you can do with your camera, right? As I always say, there's no substitute for the real world, which is why I actually teach in the real world. I don't just do webinars. I work hands-on with people in private lessons and, more interestingly, in travel photo workshops. So my travel photo business, which I run with a couple instructors now, Lauren Chagaris and Ali Richards, we do workshops all over the country, and very soon we'll be doing photo tours all over the country and all over the world. And many of these will give you an opportunity to work on your water photography with me supervising you. So I've listed here a couple workshops that are coming up that include opportunities for photographing water. Olympic National Park in Washington this August. We still have a few spots available for that. And then Watkins Glen and Finger Lakes, New York in early October. Olympic National Park will give you the chance to photograph water on the coast and in streams. And Watkins Glen and Finger Lakes gives you the opportunity to photograph exclusively waterfalls in freshwater. So it's going to be a lot of waterfalls and a lot of more specific kinds of practice. So obviously Olympic National Park is more an adventure. We get to go out to Washington and see everything from the coast all the way to the mountains, whereas Watkins Glen is drivable. And you'll be able to see one of the true marvels of the Northeast because it looks like a miniature version of a West Coast gorge, but in an hour and a half you can hike the entire glen and see, I think, 22 different waterfalls. And then we have photo tours. The difference between workshops and tours is that workshops are basically a class on location, and you pay your tuition towards me, and you pay separately your travel arrangements. Your flights, hotels, or camping and car and all that are something that you pay for, and all that you pay us for is a workshop. Whereas a photo tour involves some kind of package, so there'll be transportation involved, sometimes a flight, and there'll be a hotel, and there'll be many meals involved. There'll be a guide, there'll be group transportation, so everybody travels together, and you can kind of free yourself of navigating and getting lost and things like that. So our tours that will give you a chance to photograph flowing water are Acadia and Bar Harbor this October. We're doing a whirlwind tour of the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji, January 8th through 19th of next year. And we're going to Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, end of March into early April. And then probably, in my opinion, the most exciting destination on the board, the southern coast of Iceland, where you'll get to photograph waterfalls, geysers, icebergs, ocean features. So basically everything I talked about and more will be present in just about, the most amazing landscape there is, which is Iceland. So be sure to check out all the workshops that we're offering at bluehoursephotoventures.com, and to see more of my work, go to paulnguyenphoto.com.